rewatched the Jordan Peterson interview with Pierre Poilievre so you don't have to. You guys really owe me for this one. Because some stuff was said that Canadians need to know that the dude who is probably going to lead the country next is actually saying. But it was buried in an interview that is an hour and 40 minutes long. That's longer than it would take me to rewatch Tucker and Dale vs. Evil. Anyways, in between screaming at my phone, I took a lot of notes, so let's dive in. And trust me, the end is the worst part, so stick around. To start things off, in case you live under a rock, Pierre Poilievre is the Conservative leader who is currently leading in the polls and is very likely to be the next Prime Minister of Canada. And he sat down with Jordan Peterson, who became famous for refusing to use his students' preferred pronouns, who now spends his time posting transphobia, screaming about woke, and sharing, human milking videos? So yeah, things are going great. And while Poilievre and Peterson took their time to wade into the weirdness like crabs in boiling water, by the end of the chat, they said some truly unhinged stuff. To kick things off, they talked about how Poilievre spends his days, which honestly wasn't very interesting. Beyond him revealing that he's done 600 events in the last year. And while he framed those events as visiting factories, farms, mills, and mines, we know it's also a ton of rallies, even though we're not in an election campaign yet. Anyways, the two move on to discussing why people feel like they can't get ahead. And this is where we get one of my early favorite moments, one of the few times Poilievre speaks about women specifically.
If you're a young woman who's got a biological clock, obviously, we'll do the math.
Pointing out that we can't start families because of the housing crisis, which is part of the problem, for sure. But God, am I tired of pasty dudes acting like my lot in life is to make babies.
Raise their kids with good traditional values.
But this part of the discussion is also where we see one of the first hints of this really sneaky thing that Poilievre does throughout the interview. He's often diagnosing problems correctly, but his solutions are, to quote the guy who called this a great interview, concerning. Take, for example, when he's talking about business investment, and he points out that US business investment is higher per worker than Canadian business investment. He literally took the total business investment for both countries and divided it by their number of workers. He tells us that the US having a higher business investment per worker means they will, quote,
be able to crank out even greater wages for their people than we will.
He also takes Canada's GDP and divides it per worker and implies that this is sort of the output per worker that Canada has. And he says that because it's 60% lower than the GDP per worker than Americans, we have to work 60% more to have the same amount of income to buy food.
That's reflected in the fact that our 2 million people are lined up at food banks because they can't afford food.
What? That doesn't make sense, because in both of these examples, he's assuming that when businesses make more money and when businesses invest more, that will go into workers' wages, which is hilarious. Take Amazon, for example, which is the 5th largest company by market cap in the world. Go ahead and ask the workers at Amazon if they're feeling that increase in wages that corresponds with the business doing that well. Go on. Ask. But Poilievre is not even beginning to discuss the idea of forcing companies to pay their workers more. He's just assuming they will, and perhaps more egregiously, telling Canadians that they will. That is a false promise, and he's hoping that between his serious stare and his numbers and statistics, you won't notice the illogical leaps. The same thing happens when he talks about inflation. He says something like it's a fact, when it's not, and obviously Peterson doesn't challenge him on it. According to the Bank of Canada, we've got the second lowest inflation in the G7. And compared to our G7 counterparts, we've actually had the sharpest growth of GDP. Now, I'm not going to do what the Liberals like to do here and say this means that everything is fine. Because it's not. Because a lot of Canadians are struggling, and would you look at that? Wealth inequality just hit the highest level ever recorded in our country. So you're not struggling because of government spending on programs that help the vulnerable. You're struggling because the rich don't want to share. Which brings us back to the lie in Poilievre's first point. Or if he's not lying, he's being totally naive. He seems to think that businesses doing better and making more money means Canadians will too. But that's just not happening. The same problematic logic applies to Poilievre's view on housing. He says he wants to build more houses, and that's great. He actually has some good ideas here, like combating NIMBYism and pushing for faster approvals, which is cool provided it doesn't lead to corner cutting. But he also implies housing prices would go down if developers didn't have to spend so much on bureaucracy, which he used really broadly. Like, he applied the term bureaucracy to developers spending money on lobbying.
The consultants, lawyers, accountants, lobbyists that the developer has to hire in order to get the approval. So in other words, we're spending twice, in Vancouver, we spend twice as much on bureaucrats than we do on all other things combined to build a home.
Which leads me once again to ask, why would you assume those developers would pass those savings along to buyers instead of pocketing the increased profit? At this point, Poilievre also says we need to free up more land for construction and points out that Canada's huge, so why are we having trouble building more houses?
We've got so much land. Like we should have the most affordable housing in the world. I mean, it should be dirt cheap because we have the most dirt.
First of all, there are some very good reasons why most Canadians live within 100 kilometers of the US border. A lot of Canada is not very habitable. We also have a lot of protected land like the Greenbelt, and we know how badly developers want to get their grubby little paws on that. Just ask Doug Ford. But if we build on that land, the consequences here for things like biodiversity are genuinely dystopian. So let's hope that's not what he means by freeing up more land. Moving on. Another thing that made me laugh were the insane ads throughout the interview. Like when Poilievre was talking about young Canadians being exhausted because they have to work while being in school, the video paused to sell us a supplement if we're feeling sluggish. But another one of the video's main sponsors is a pro-life organization. With Poilievre still visible in the background, a voiceover tells the story of a woman who already has 8 children and a quote-unquote tumultuous marriage. They say she found out she was pregnant and could not bear the thought of having another child, but they convinced her to. That's where they end her story and frame it as a victory. That is what seemingly lined Peterson's pockets during his interview with Pierre Poilievre. Yikes. Back to the interview itself, Poilievre just does his usual thing where he lies about socialism and calls everyone a socialist even when they're not. In fact, he calls Trudeau an
authoritarian socialism.
I don't think we need to dive into any of this because it's just dumb, and it distracts from serious conversation about government policy, like the fact that the carbon tax is a market-based solution, which is actually what the conservative approach to climate change should be, and not a super progressive far-left socialist one. But instead, we have Poilievre talking about environmentalists like this.
You want to talk to these environmental loons.
The most concerning part of the interview, though, happens at the end. It really, in 2025, should be disqualifying. But then again, so should taking Jordan Peterson seriously, and Poilievre does this.
On behalf of all Canadians, want to thank you for your immense courage and the personal political and non-political price that you have paid for standing up for your convictions and defending freedom of speech.
Anyways, Poilievre and Peterson had a nice little chat about racism, in which they discuss it being imported into Canada as if it didn't exist before.
Put aside race, this obsession with race that wokeism has reinserted.
Well, invented even.
Invented in many ways.
When I moved to Toronto, it was as race blind as any country, as any city could be.
Right.
Right. And that's flipped. And it's flipped because of that obsessive concern with race. Right. That was something we 100% did not need in Canada.
Yeah.
Right. We basically, what would you say, imported and invented racism in Canada. Right. As a consequence of policy.
And Poilievre blames an increase in hate crimes on wokeism. Not, of course, on the documented rise of the far right within Canada. Or the rise of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Right. But instead, Poilievre blames it on people recognizing existing inequities in our society.
Wokeism seeks to divide people into these different groups and subgroups, and we see the results in a 250% increase in hate crimes. But we're going to get back to the basic principle that people are judged based on their individual character.
They're literally doing the whole I don't see color bit, which is a great way of shutting down vital discussions about racism and systemic inequities that are baked into our society, which will continue to exist and hurt people regardless of whether Jordan Peterson and Pierre Poilievre believe it's happening. So there you have it, Canada's probable next Prime Minister in all of his glory. What do you think of all of this?